Why X Matters is recorded live in the CJNU studios in downtown Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis. Welcome to Why X Matters, a limited series podcast where we invite a panel of industry experts to discuss issues and topics that matter. On today's episode, Why Accessibility Matters. Thank you for listening to Why X Matters. My name is Nolan Bicknell. Today, we are going to be talking about accessibility, a word that's thrown around in a lot of different contexts, and it's in the news frequently. More than 10 years ago, so in December 2013, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act became law. This legislation included, quote, 5 standard building blocks for making real, measurable, and effective changes to accessibility in our province. In today's show, we're going to break down what exactly that means, what organizations and individuals need to be truly accessible for all. First off, I want to acknowledge that the conversations around accessibility are vast and varied. We will do our best today to cover as much as possible, be as in-depth as possible, but I just wanted to, at the start, sort of acknowledge we can't possibly cover everything to everyone in one episode, but perhaps in the future we will return to the topic in maybe a part 2 and a part 3 to continue these conversations and hopefully spark additional ones. So, let's get right into it. Let's do the introductions for all of our esteemed panel of guests. First up, we have Dr. Jennifer Frain, CEO of New Directions. Dr. Jennifer Frain came to New Directions in 2001 as a clinical psychologist, serving as the coordinator of programs and evaluations and Manitoba Learning Center. She then held several other director-level positions before she was appointed as the CEO in 2006. Jennifer received her doctorate in clinical psychology from Concordia University in 1997. She is committed to New Directions, providing responsive and individualized services that foster the hopes and dreams of people and their communities. Dr. Frain, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, Jenel Shaw, Executive Director of Arts Accessibility Network, Manitoba. Jenel is a self-taught visual artist who graduated with her Master's in Disability Studies from the University of Manitoba. Her dissertation, an autoethnological study of art as a tool of empowerment, examined her own experiences with mental illness and disability art. Jenel is a passionate advocate for the disability community with a focus on accessibility in the arts. Jenel is the Executive Director of Arts Accessibility Network Manitoba, the Liaison Director for the Manitoba Cultural Society of the Deaf, and the co-chair of the Manitoba Artist-Run Centers Coalition. Jenel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for the invitation.
And last but not least, David Kron, Executive Director of the Cerebral Palsy Association of Manitoba, also serves on the steering committees of Barrier-Free Manitoba, Integrated Adult Services, Pilot Project, Government of Manitoba, and Disability Matters Votes, and is a member of the Children's Coalition, the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg, and Make Poverty History Manitoba. David is a lifelong resident of Winnipeg and has always been interested in the welfare of traditionally underserved and underrepresented people. He has long been involved in the disability community as an employee, volunteer, advocate, and as a person with a visible disability. This has expanded to poverty awareness within this community and in other vulnerable sectors, giving all citizens an opportunity to be a contributing member of an accessible and equitable Manitoba is his passion. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invite.
My pleasure. All right. So, as I mentioned at the top, this is a big conversation. Section 1, we just kind of want to get your perspectives, maybe lay a bit of the groundwork of your backgrounds. So, maybe explain at a high level what the word accessibility means to you, how you champion the cause of accessibility in your day-to-day work within your organization. Dr. Frain, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, accessibility means the ability to access. Having an accessible world is one where people have access to community, to workplaces, and to services that all citizens should be able to have equal access to. So ease of access is also part of when I think about accessibility, it should be easy for everyone to be able to access. And universality is another word I would throw into accessibility when we're thinking about accessibility, that it should be universal, and also universal in terms of it's universally good for everybody to have an accessible world.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you. David, you up next.
So accessibility, like you said at the start, means everything for everybody. And it's so vast that I never worry about it can't be one policy or one program or one manual, or it's really just a willingness to accept that yes should be your default answer, and then you work towards that. Also, being open to suggestions on how you provide a new service, how you provide a new building, how you employ a new employee, and say, okay, what do we need to make this successful? And it shouldn't be a complaints-based service. It's exhausting. The disability community can't be disability cops. And so we need to change it at a fundamental basis on how we do business.
Yeah, the onus being put on folks. I hear that a lot in, the Black community or the Indigenous community, where those groups are expected to be the ones educating everyone all the time. And I'm guessing it's the same in the disability community.
Yes.
Yeah. Janelle, same question to you. What does accessibility mean?
Yeah, I think Jennifer and David said perfectly what it's about. I think I would add on to that for me personally, accessibility means that you're continually interacting with the disability community, that you're reaching out for consultations, that you're asking them what they need. Because for a long time, the disability community has had others speak for us. And so it's a huge push to be the ones who are the consultants, who are the leaders. So, if you have a program that you're looking to get accessibility information on, reach out to those disability organizations. They have the members who know what it's like day to day to live with these barriers and how to address them. So I just wanted to add that little piece to it, like the social aspect of accessibility, that we need to open our doors and communications to really understand what everybody needs.
Yeah, it might take a little bit longer when you're launching a project to actually talk to the people who it's going to affect, but it turns out that actually improves the projects from the ground up. Absolutely. So you mentioned barriers, Jenel. Let's talk about that. So physical, architectural, communication barriers, technology barriers, attitudinal barriers, policy barriers, all the different types of barriers to accessibility that exist. And I'm sure there's more that I'm not existing. So what can the average Winnipegger do to help remove these barriers, to sort of force our politicians to talk about moving these barriers? What are some challenges to achieving a barrier-free city that Winnipeg has? I know right now we're at Portage in Maine, and during the Vote Open conversation, there was a huge discussion about the accessibility to get just across the street and how long it takes someone either in a wheelchair or with movement disabilities to just cross the street, something we take for granted. So maybe, Jenel, I'll start with you. What can the average person do to first recognize the barriers that exist and then try to remove or at least reduce the amount of barriers that people face every day?
Right. Well, in terms of architecture, you have to remember that, when the cities were being built in the 1900s, the late 1800s, the disability community were not part of the community. We were institutionalized. We weren't in those settings. So the environment was built without us there. So now we're in a position where we have this built environment and it's not accessible. So what can we do to change it? And there's some great legislation out there for if any spaces are being rebuilt or remodeled, you have to follow these new accessibility laws. But I think the biggest thing is open and honest communication. They just released the 2022 Canadian survey on disabilities in Canada, and it used to be 22% of Canadians identified with a disability. Well, now it's 27, and they estimate it's going to be in the low 30s. The next time they do it in 5 years. So we have a population that's growing in disability. So it's really important that you start those communications. So one thing I would suggest is to attend some anti-ableist or disability awareness training. The Independent Living Resource Center has the DOT program, so that's a really great resource where you can learn directly from folks with disabilities, kind of the protocols of how to interact with people, how to speak with people, and that sort of thing. We are also creating an anti-ableist workshop for the arts, which was funded by the Winnipeg Foundation, and we're setting that out in the spring. And that really is going to show folks, talk about language, what kind of language we use, because that's always evolving. What does ableism mean, and how is that seen in our day-to-day lives? So I think the first step is really, doing some research into disability justice and just awareness training and just learning more.
Yes. Start the ball rolling.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Dr. Frain, I'll pass it over to you. Same sort of question. How, when it comes to barriers, what does that make you think of, and how can people reduce those?
An easy one, and when people think about accessibility, they often think about getting into a building or accessibility into a building, and that is only one part. But in that part, we could at least mandate that new builds are universally designed. So people often say, stop at, well, we can't change this building, we can't change the Old Bay build, we can't change old buildings because it's too expensive. So I think minimally making sure that all new builds are accessible and universal design. And I think also that people tend to overshoot the expense it will be, like employers, or communities, to make the world more accessible. It actually isn't that much. It isn't more expensive, and particularly at the beginning design part, it's not more expensive. But some of the alterations or accommodations that can be made are not so hard. Like when you're redesigning your waiting room, make sure that the tables are low so somebody who uses a wheelchair is able to see face to face, or make sure that you change up one of your bathrooms and make sure that it's a fully accessible bathroom. These are not hugely expensive or prohibitive, and they are a way to include everyone into your space. I think the attitudinal one is huge. So I think also recognizing, early any societal change, it takes one, then two, then three. We have to get a groundswell of people with disabilities sitting on boards of directors, sitting at policy tables, sitting in government, to be able to have their voices heard at a high level to change the system. And it's usually by agitation, by abilities, rights work done. We have Disability Matters votes where all Manitobans can get involved in every election in the province in terms of making sure that when the candidates come to the door, that they're asked about what is your stance on the priorities set by the Disability Matters votes. So there's all sorts of ways for everybody to take part. And I think another one, I love this saying from one of our strong leaders in this town, is really all of us who are currently abled might not be. Like, we're all just presently abled, and that as we age, and so universal design is good for so many people. It's good for young mums. It's good for who are pushing baby strollers. It's good for people who have invisible disabilities that you don't see them, in terms of different ways to scrutinize your applicants or do your recruitment of staff, so that you're making sure that you're not biasing right from the get-go of weaning out people with disabilities. So all sorts of ways that the public and all of us can get involved in getting rid of the barriers.
Beautifully said. David, is there anything even that you could add to that great
There's
answer?
not much, but I think just kind of where I started with before, just be open to change, right? I'm taking Jennifer's point on, it doesn't have to cost any more. A good design is a good design, and it's a good design for everybody.
Yeah.
Even let's take the disability community out of the picture. If your store's so crowded with crap at the end of the aisle and your aisles are so close, people without disabilities can't get into your store, right? So it really, I find the attitudinal barrier is the big one, right? You don't want to be defeated before you even get started, right? And it's how do you change that? And I'll just use my favorite metaphor. It's, workplace health and safety was not a big thing back in the day, and then government mandated it. And now it's just part of everybody's culture. When you go to work, you have a workplace health and safety rep or a committee, and you try to figure out how to make work more safe, right? And the accessibility world, that's where we need to get to. That we just need a new way of doing business.
It can be done. It has been done,
Yes.
and it can be done.
Yes.
Dr. Frain, you mentioned universal design. Maybe I'll go back to you. Can you define what that is and how we can implement it on the various sort of levels of society?
Well, the universal design usually applies to physical spaces, right?
Right.
So it's really about building no curb, no lift entranceways. It's having wide enough doorways for a large size wheelchair to manage, elevators to do the same, bathrooms that are perfectly able to be used by somebody who uses a wheelchair. Proper buttons at levels that are for people in wheelchairs, or braille, to have braille on the doors and braille in the elevators for people who have sight problems or sight inability. there's another word for that, right?
Low vision.
Yeah,
Low
low
vision.
vision. So low vision, and then so those kinds of things are universal design. Buses that lower when so that people don't have to step up into a bus, they lower. So we have that now, where you hear the bus go down and people can get onto the buses more or easier. And the front of the buses now normally have enough space there to properly not have everybody squeezed to death in the very beginning of the bus. If there's enough room for a stroller or a wheelchair or whatever.
Yeah.
So those are all universal designs.
Absolutely.
Can
And
I
please.
add something to that?
Yeah, please do.
I was just thinking, also, we're talking about universal design, but there's also like maybe universal practices that we should start, right? So one thing that I've noticed a lot, especially in the arts world, when you register for an event, one of the things they'll ask you is, do you have access needs? And that's a very simple way. If we did that all the time, you might not be able to accommodate everyone, but at least you know what your audience is asking for, what they need, and if you can't maybe make it work this time, you'll need it for the next time. So that's a practice that I would love to see become universal.
And some of that's now in law, that you have to have some of that available through the customer service standard.
Right.
I was just about to say something else, though, that you go ahead, David.
Oh, all I was going to say, like, there are good standards out there when you're talking about building a building, right? It's Canadian standards B651 A and B. And, like, I'm literally doing a webinar the end of the month on the National Building Code for 2025, right? But those are the bare minimums, right?
Yeah.
And what we really need to do is work on changing it so that, like, we need to educate the designers, the professors.
Yeah.
We need to talk to the developers of buildings and say, look, we don't want you to work towards the bare minimum. We want you to achieve. We want the province of Manitoba and the federal government to be leaders in accessibility, right? Again, we don't want to go for the bare minimum here. We want to achieve more. And we really want to force folks to do a human right. We're not looking for charity here.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
What I was going to say before was also the universal design of websites and online.
Right.
So that there's been marked improvement in that now, that people are considering their website redesign with disability in mind, with different abilities in mind. And so having sharper contrast between colors and having it available in different formats that's advertised right up front, all of those things are improvements, and I think showing that we are getting a little bit better in terms of putting it not as a last thought or an afterthought,
Right.
but as a forethought.
And just to add to that, getting my nephew is at Red River taking computer technology or something. He's developing websites, but they don't teach him what accessibility design is. So put that part of the curriculum, because, guess what? There's like thousands of websites that all need to be updated.
Yeah.
And if you taught him those skills, he'd have a marketable job.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? So, there's a chicken and the egg thing. You got to show people that there's money to be made with accessibility.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And to build on that again, since we're all doing that, I would also say it's also important for universal design to expect disability everywhere. So we, in terms of the arts, right, we often have, a theater will be rebuilt, for example, and they'll really consider the accessibility of the audience, but they won't expect admin with disabilities. They won't expect actors who will use wheelchairs, right? So the green room isn't accessible. The showers there don't include an accessible stall. There's no ramp to get on the stage. Just these really simple things. I think it's really important when you're doing that, not just to look at the customer base, but consider that, expect us to be everywhere.
Universal means universal.
That's right.
Yeah.
Not just the public part of it, but also your admin, your back of stage, and all of that
Yeah.
needs to be
For
considered.
everybody in the building.
You got it.
Everyone.
Yeah.
I want to linger on the attitudinal barriers a little
Yeah.
bit longer. What have you seen in your work and in your lives? What are some of the biggest challenges to overcoming the mindsets that people have when it comes to accessibility and universal design? Is it just a case of people need to be educated and reminded, or is there something deeper there? David, maybe for you first.
Sure. So we need to start with action. The education will come after. If you force people to do it because it's the law, then they'll figure out why pretty quick and put 2 and 2 together. The other piece is, let's take a moment and take a breath and just think, I'm 56 years old, where we were 50 years ago, right? We had segregated schools. We didn't even have these conversations. We have people living in community. It all needs to be better. And it has gotten a lot better than it was. When I was going to elementary, I was the only kid in my elementary school with a disability, and my mother had to fight to get me in that school. So, we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go, but let's take a minute and take a breath too, right?
Dr. Frain?
I work, our work at New Directions, the disability that we're most familiar with, and we work with the most are folks with intellectual disabilities. And there's all sorts of barriers to people with intellectual disabilities about thinking that their voices don't count, or what they don't, you don't need to bother asking them, because, they're not going to be able to tell you what they want or need. And that is so not true. And historically, people have suffered a lot for not having their voices heard. So intellectual disability, people discount folks all the time, and they have hearts and minds, and their blood is red like the rest of ours, and they love and they dislike, and they have all those things. So they're very much as all of us are, and need to have their voices heard. And there's a lot of like, I am a professional, and one of your questions, I think maybe I'm foreshadowing it, but is around the professionals management of people with disabilities, because historically, we assess, we diagnose, we treat, and it's sort of like that person, but we're not listening to that person, right? So I think certainly at New Directions, and I think our sister organizations are much better these days at being more person-led, really listening to what people want, how they want to be. So we have advisory committees, and we have even now some of our folks help hire the new staff and interview as part of the process. They try to fire the staff too, but that doesn't always happen exactly that way. But nonetheless, there's much more voice given to, or not given, that we're listening to them, and going and making sure that we're hearing and paying attention. So lots of discrimination against people with intellectual disabilities, and they were very much back in the day and not too long ago institutionalized. So we're still part of the deinstitutionalization, and the Manitoba Developmental Center is still not fully emptied. So New Directions and others are responding to the last folks that are in there to get them out and into community. And never again shall we institutionalize babies born with an intellectual disability.
Yeah.
Jenel, anything to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just to give an example, specifically for the intellectual disability community, it wasn't until February 2012 that the Supreme Court of Canada made a decision that ruled on the ability of adults with intellectual disabilities to testify. So this was specifically for a case with sexual a sexual assault complaint, and they had, so they have this criteria for people with intellectual disabilities that they would have to, they would have to understand that they couldn't testify unless they could explain the meaning of abstract concepts like promise, truth, and falsehood, though no other witness had to do these things. So it was quite terrible, because someone would experience sexual assault and they couldn't even take the stand to speak for themselves and their own experiences. So this just illustrates, this is only 10 years ago, right? So it just kind of shows attitudinally how behind we are and how much more work we need to do.
100%.
Yeah. How much of that is media portrayal? What's that been like, and how has it evolved over the last maybe 20, 50 years even?
Yeah.
I still don't think there's a lot of media portrayal of people with intellectual disabilities in
a positive light.
In a positive light, I don't think so. So there isn't a lot of positive. And really, when you think about it, it's my mom's generation. When you birthed a child with an intellectual disability, you were told that if you were a good parent, you put your child to an institution. So we're pretty close in time, right? We need more time to heal and recover and learn better, I think, going forward. And as David said, there are positive signs of improvement, very definitely, but we have a long way to go for sure. But at New Directions, we do all staff coming in do abilities awareness training. So, and we have a very, very low tolerance for any staff who don't get the understanding that it's not our lives, it's their lives. So they're the drivers of the bus. So, Yeah, I think we've come a long way, but the attitudinal barriers are the ones that are going to probably take the longest. I think I'm hoping
agree.
that universal design and those kind of principles, partly because the baby boomers are going to force it.
Yeah.
Baby boomers are a great demographic because they're just going to
Right.
push that envelope, and we're going to get more accessible design for their wheelchairs and walkers.
And I just want to also point out that, attitudinal, it's like we're all in the field. We get it. We're drinking the Kool-Aid here. My challenge is always, how do you affect change for everybody? Like when you don't have a family member directly affected by a disability, or yourself, right? And I can't force you to think a different way, right? I can yell and scream from the top of my lungs and tell you shouldn't do this. And that's why we need government and leaders to show the path and have that carrot and the stick thing, right? Like, that's why we passed the law. We now need to enforce it. The problem with the AMA is there is no enforcement, right? They don't have that
Compliance framework.
compliance framework. And, right now you have to go to the Human Rights Commission to do that. Well, it's 8 years, and the level of entry and the barrier to it, some of it's pretty low-hanging fruit, right? And there are other ways of doing it. The ADA in the States, they just allow people to sue the organization for compliance. We went a different way, but, there are ways we can do it. And, I don't want to wait for another 2 more generations in order for this to happen, right?
Anything to add, Jenel, on that one?
Yeah, I think one of the positives is that we're seeing, in terms of like media representation, we are seeing more films and stories and TV shows with folks with disabilities in them. It's not, some actor who's going to win the Oscar because he decided to, play somebody with a disability, which, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but for me, an able-bodied person acting as a disabled person is the same to blackface as for me. It's just really not appropriate. So that's one thing that I think is really positive. We're seeing more of that. We're seeing more ASL that's being shown on sports events. They have the ASL interpreters for the oh gosh, what's the big football thing?
NFL?
Super Bowl.
The Super Bowl. Sorry, I'm not a big sports fan. But we had some really great the last few years ASL interpreters that were a part of that. So you're seeing more representation out there. But then if you look at the news, the stories that they're reporting on of folks with disabilities, or, oh, this person had a mental health crisis, and that this situation arose. And then there's this fear that comes up, especially around folks with mental illness. As someone who's part of the community, I get this a lot. There's a lot of there's not as much understanding. So, for example, my diagnosis is borderline personality disorder, and people hear that and think, oh, so you must be schizophrenic or have multiple personalities, which is not the case at all. It's more closer to anxiety and depression. So there's a lot of assumptions that people make when you say you have a mental illness, and not only that, but the community internalizes it as well. So that's another thing that's kind of an extra layer, is that self-stigmatization. So I have ableist thoughts all the time that I have to combat within myself. I am like when you invited me to come to this, I had those doubts in my mind. Should I really, do I know enough? Am I smart enough? And so it's constantly battling those thoughts in your head that say you're not good enough. So if I have that in my head, I could imagine that those without lived experience of mental illness don't have that voice that speaks back to them, that says, you know what, no, I've lived through this. That's not the case. So it's a really tough situation because ableism is really embedded in our society. You don't even notice it sometimes.
Yeah, it's so baked in that it's just inherent at this point. That's a perfect segue into the next section about accessibility and mental health. So I'll just pose the question: what are some mental health challenges in the accessibility and disability communities that people may not be aware of that we can speak to? And what are some solutions or programs that you've seen in your work or just in the community at large that try to address some of those challenges? Maybe David, we'll start with you.
So I can start with not being a clinician, but really just access to services. I am.
Or wait lists once you get access to your
it's
info.
just let's hire more psychologists and psychiatrists, right? Like hard stop. When you're in crisis, you're in crisis. You can't wait 6 to 8 months. I was trying to help one of our members with a big crisis, and I was phoning around and asking, and I said, look, we'll pay. I'm not even looking for, like, I've got a Visa card here. And there was a lot of clinicians that wouldn't even take people on a waiting list anymore because their waiting lists were so long.
Brutal.
So whether you have a diagnosis of a disability or not, you just, the mental health is part of the body, right? It's part of the medical system. We shouldn't have to pay privately for that service. The government is always chronically underfunded it for generations because it was that hidden part, right? Somebody would self-medicate with a bottle and be homeless, and right, and that it's always somebody else's fault. So whether you have a disability or not, we need more services.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Frain, I'll pass it over to you.
And I think when you add in New Direction's case, an intellectual disability and a mental health issue, what we find are clinicians not trained enough to be able to understand that both can be true, that you can be depressed and have an intellectual disability. So what we have found successful over time, and there's debate. I've been in the field long enough to have heard both sides of the debate and the pendulum swing about should we train all medical students and all psychology students to work with people with intellectual disabilities and disabilities of all kinds? Should we train everybody, or do we train the few who show aptitude and want to do that, right? And I'm down to we need the few who really understand, and rather than having the knowledge be thinly distributed amongst a whole bunch of medical practitioners and psychologists, instead have it deeper, but have those people accessible, more of them available to support the people who need that support. And deserve that support. So we find that the discrimination of disability on top of mental health is like a double whammy.
No kidding.
And so I think really focusing in on that becoming maybe a specialty or a subspecialty within psychiatry and within clinical psychology would be a grand idea.
Yeah. So Jenel, this is your wheelhouse.
Sure, yeah.
When it comes to mental health, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So something that people might not think about, but which we have to recognize living in Winnipeg and the weather that we have, that folks' mental health changes during the winter. And that goes for not only folks with mental illness, but people with physical disabilities as well. So with the colder weather, joints become sore, there's more ice, it's harder to get out, there's issues of isolation, there's issues of brain fog, seasonal affective disorder. So there's some folks in the community who can do really great work during the spring and summer, but if you ask them to do those exact same tasks during the fall and winter, they can't. And I think that's something that people don't recognize often, that the environment and the weather have a huge impact on people's mental health. And what resources we have for folks. So if you're on disability, it's very limited resources, and that stress can affect folks. So
For sure.
We had one of our members who had to choose between their phone or the TV. They couldn't afford the internet, so all they had was the phone and TV and the homebound. So that is the only way to access the world. And in the end, a family member had to step in to pay for those, one of the services. And to me, it just blows my mind, that we are not supporting folks enough to be able to, support them where they are. And, or not cleaning the sidewalks properly, not cleaning the back alleys well. Unfortunately, most of the accessible entrances are.
Right.
So there's a lot of considerations. But, your environment in Winnipeg is so important.
No kidding. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about housing, too. I know Cohabit is is raising funds, and that sounds like an incredible program. So maybe I'll talk to you, David, first.
Sure.
How does housing fit into the equation? You talked about homelessness and how that kind of used to be the case for a lot of people with disabilities.
And it still is. I've got a lot of members that are living in their parents' basements that are trying to get out into the community, or folks that have to have roommates that they don't want to have a roommate, but they can't afford it. And I had a meeting earlier today with a member who's wanting to move where he's at. There are not even minimally accessible suites. And we were talking to one apartment, and he wanted to change the vanity in the bathroom to a pedestal sink so he could get around. That's the only accommodation he needed to make that space work, and they refused. And he said, I'll pay for it myself. And it was still a hard stop, right? So Cohabit is a housing initiative that the CP Association has started. We really want to get it so that people can move out of their parents' basement and into it. Ideally, it's like 120 units where they live communally. Like we found out, we'll have a chef, we'll have a bar, we'll have a movie theater, we'll have, facilities. It's kind of like assisted living, but for young people, right? And then we also have to add in all those services, right? So that we can pool and we can actually save government money. There's a lot of people sitting in hospital beds waiting for a place to go. And we want to provide that in places that, whether they have an intellectual disability would be part of it, but also those folks that don't have an intellectual disability, that just have extreme physical disabilities. There's over 500 people in personal care homes that shouldn't be there just because there's no other place to go.
Yeah.
Right.
Just that autonomy for people to have
That's right.
the ability to.
And it's choice. And we want it, ideally we want it to be a really fun place to go live. Right.
Dr. Frain, anything about housing that you can add?
Huge. Yeah. I mean, a lot of our folks are on EIA. They have very minimal incomes, and there's very little stock out there. And with our folks, landlords don't want to rent to them very often. So that's been a big problem. We started a newish, for us anyway, a few years ago, a new model called the supported cluster housing, where we've got domain over apartment blocks or floors of apartment blocks where our folks live, and we have 24-hour support for them as they need it. But that's when so fundamentally we did that because the landlords were blacklisting our folks. So we weren't getting any apartments for them. And New Directions, because of our insurance, we can't rent. Like if they're going to pay, they pay their own rent, and they have the right to do that. But if they do that, the landlords weren't renting to them, even with references from us and even promises from us. I should correct that. We have some wonderful landlords, supportive landlords in this town. We really do. But there's not enough stock and there's not enough of them to supply the needs for the people. And so we were finding our people getting homeless and being in the bus shelters, actually, were some of the folks that could or were supported by New Directions. So the cluster housing, supported cluster housing model is one that is working well to get people safer and with choice. And one of the fellows, we moved him in there, and this is one of my heartfelt stories about New Directions, of which I have many stories, but he used to be found sometimes curled up in a little ball, sometimes black and blue, outside of one of our day programs, and they would find him there and pick him up and help him get some food into him and stuff. He was very hard to house, this fellow. He moved into our first supported cluster on Main Street and reported very happily within the first few days that he had a 4-hour-long shower because he could. Right. He could finally have his shower as long as he wanted it to. And so he has thrived in this new setting, right? But that's a lot of creativity and work and the support of New Directions to get that to happen. And there's so many in need. Yeah. And there's so little housing stock, so that landlords have all sorts of choice about who they're going to rent to, and they don't choose our people.
Yeah. One of the neat things is that I was just speaking to someone the other day, and they were talking about how in Trinidad and Tobago they have a law now that 10% of all new housing has to be accessible. That's something I would like to see here in Canada, to build that stock.
Yeah.
But one of the things that you were touching on was that mentality of not in our backyard. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge attitudinal barrier that the community faces, where the Winnipeg community, yes, we want to have these people out of the institutions and in the community, just not mine. Right. And so that's a huge barrier that folks come up against.
We haven't really touched on addiction yet, but maybe let's go around the circle and just talk about how that affects people with mental and physical disabilities differently than, or is it the same? Maybe Dr. Frain, you can start.
I don't know if it's the same. I mean, I think anywhere where you have more support, you're safer, right? Anywhere where you have a little bit more money or you have a stocked fridge, you're safer. Anywhere where you have loved ones who are watching after you, you're safer, right? So the folks that were institutionalized back in the day are now out of the institutions. Lots of them don't have family or have family who are connected to them. So they're very isolated. They're very alone. And that makes them really vulnerable to addictions. So self-medication is how it starts, I'm pretty sure, or cozying up with your buddies, and enjoying a time or two, and then the addiction gets the hold of folks. So we have a lot of difficulties around addictions. We do lots of naloxone delivery and training on naloxone and lots of work. We still need to, and it's really good that this new government has a ministry that's got addictions attached to it, clearly, along with homelessness, to really look at ways to get additional addiction resources in town, and ones that are less middle classy. And more, for the people on the street who
universally
are
designed,
more universally designed and accessible to everybody. Because some of the institutions we do have can be a little off-putting, and females too. We have, we work with young women and older women and transgender folks who are affected by the sex trade, and sending them to an addictions like a male or a co-ed is often problematic in that they're more vulnerable even in that setting. So having the right settings for people, making the right environments for people to thrive in, like you're doing with your project, that's really a lot of what we do at New Directions, is try to figure out with each individual what's the right environment where they can live their best lives,
And it really comes down to that choice or options. One option does not fit all.
Right.
Of course.
Right. And
addiction or anything.
Right. It doesn't matter what it is, like, and just kind of circling back is when you provide people the opportunity in community it helps with their mental health. It helps with their if you're sitting alone in the dark drinking, right? Like, it's just everything's connected to everything, right? And I think it's not one piece of the puzzle, it's putting the whole puzzle together. And it's really getting different organizations, levels of government, all working together. Like, all these problems are solvable. Like, we're a very rich province, we're a very rich country. And just as a good example, I told this to Councillor Matt Allard with just building more houses and universal design is, somebody who has a building with, universal designs, let them go first in the approval process. Doesn't cost the city anything more.
Yeah.
And then that's money for the developer, right? Say you could do the same thing with environmental pieces and energy efficiency and all that stuff, but you can change the policy and make it better and incentivize that activity, right, where it doesn't cost government anything. We've always played the blame game, right, with folks, whether they blame them for having a mental health issue, they blame them for having an addiction, they blame them for having a disability, right? It's always about them and never about us, right, as a society.
Jenel?
Yeah, addictions has a huge part in the mental illness community. Speaking from personal experience, when I was in my 20s, I dealt with addiction very severely. I was self-medicating and trying to control what was going on with me. Sometimes it was a way to help me get through when there wasn't any beds available in the psychiatric wards, which is another thing that's pretty awful. So one thing I always try to tell folks is that when you're interacting with someone with addictions, it's not the addiction that's the problem. That's not why they're there. It's they've had some traumatic experience. They've had some mental illness things. Nobody chooses to be an addict, right? That's not your goal in life. And so I think you have to treat more than just the addiction. It goes beyond that, and really addressing trauma and mental illness and making that part of the healing journey, not just about stop drinking or stop doing these drugs, but mental health supports and what Jennifer was saying about I lost my train of thought there for a minute. Sorry.
No problem.
No, so I lost
That's okay.
it. I lost it. So
But
I
I'm
got-
also thinking, one of my colleagues or staff just told me the other day that I'm going to forget what it was, but we've lost our second houses or something like that. Like we used to have work and home and then something else, or third houses. We've lost our third houses, like church,
spaces, yeah.
community.
Right.
We've lost the third house. So what we're doing is we're all sitting by ourselves, isolated on tablets and whatever. We've lost that community part. And the community part is a huge safety net for people with addictions, right? Like loneliness, self-medication, all those things. I would throw in that, there's some bad actors in here with the opiates and stuff, right? That were introduced into the world and causing no end of misery. So it's not. It can be bad pharma too, or big pharma that can make a causal link into the addiction. But I think that it is a whole approach, a holistic approach that needs to be taken for all of these issues around disability, around accessibility, around addictions, around mental health. It's got to be. Having enough resource, not the catalog and not individualized so much, but more communal.
Right.
So group work, for example, rather than all the individual focus. Like in psychology, there's not enough psychology. So movement has certainly in New Directions, we've moved to more group work because we can see more people. And the added bonus is there's an additional therapeutic aspect to them all being to people being together in their shared experiences.
Just to add on to that piece is, in reality, when it comes down to addictions, we also have to think about it's a medical issue.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right? It's chemistry, right? Like my dad smoked 3 packs of cigarettes from the age of 12 to 65 when he passed away from throat cancer. He was in the hospital and all he wanted was a cigarette, right?
Yep.
And, we can't let the medical industry off the hook. Like they have a part to play with this to break that. And also, people fail when they're trying to come out of addiction, so we have to allow them the grace of failure. And sometimes it takes 4 or 5, 10 times to, like, it's not one and done, right? Like,
Yeah, one thing that I was taught when I was going through kind of recovery and stuff like that, that the road to recovery isn't a straight line, but it's a spiral that goes forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. And it's about having that upward movement, but still recognizing that it's going to happen, that you're going to fall back a few times.
There will be setbacks, yeah, for sure. Thank you all for that. I mean, we said at the top of the show that this was such a vast topic, and I think we're going in a lot of different places, but it speaks to the universality of every single element of life is affected by the accessibility conversation, right? And this is just proof of that. So final thoughts. What conversations like this can people have with their families, with their work, with their boss, with their coworkers, with their friends about accessibility, and how can we shift mindsets to include those universal design considerations? And just other final thoughts if you want to wrap them up. We'll start with Dr. Frain.
Well, having joined David on the Barrier Free Manitoba steering committee for a number of years, I mean, really it's getting compliance on an act to make people. It's a bit like we can talk to people all you want about putting on a seatbelt, that seatbelts save lives, and seatbelts are a really good idea. What did it was the mandating of putting a seatbelt on. So it became the law. So there is a law, and what we need is that law to be enacted and implemented thoroughly and completely with compliance to help people. I think it's through experience that as these things become required and become more commonplace, the proper accessible customer standards, the access to transportation, the information technology, and the other standards as well, as they become more embedded because it's required, it'll become commonplace. We won't even think about putting on our seatbelts anymore. It's just how it is.
It's generational change is what I'm looking for. Nothing happens, just like I said, 50 years ago. Another 50 years, right? I'm really trying to set it up for the next generation so they don't have to battle for every little thing, and every, we have to advocate as folks with disabilities for everything. And it's exhausting, and you have to pick your battles, but you shouldn't have to. This is a right, and we're not looking for charity. That's the big thing. So when you have that opportunity, call that MLA, call the Premier, call the Prime Minister,
right to the paper.
Exactly, right? And there's 234,000 Manitobans with a disability, and as Jenel said, it's growing. We're not going anywhere. So we have power in numbers. We just have to organize, and
Yeah, beautiful.
For me, I would say if, just directly within your family and friends, look to create safe spaces. I mean, for me personally, while I'm not, you can't tell I'm disabled by looking at me, I always make a point of self-disclosing that. I find by the more I do that, the more other people feel comfortable about it, the more we speak about, the less misunderstandings there are, and just the easier it gets. I'd also suggest checking out, for example, some documentaries. So People First of Canada made an amazing video called The Freedom Tour. If you want to learn about the struggle of folks with intellectual disabilities in Canada, amazing video. You can check it out on their website, People First Winnipeg or People First Manitoba. It's on one or the other.
Cool.
And to look into things like that, try to find some research that was done from the lens of the community. So that either it's led by someone from the community or it's informed by someone from the community. And that area still needs to get built. There's still too much that's being researched by doctors and scientists and not having our thought into that. But yeah, that's a good place to start, is checking out that video.
Beautiful. So yeah, let's leave people with some resources, some links, some phone numbers.
Yep.
Where can people find out more about your organization specifically, or where should they go? What documentaries? What books? Let's leave people with some resources to educate themselves. Dr. Frain?
Well, New Directions is newdirections.mb.ca, but I would also highly recommend the BFM website for information about the implementation of the AMA and to educate themselves about what needs to happen next to get this act fully implemented and actually benefiting Manitobans.
Beautiful.
yeah. And I want to have a shout out to 211. It's just someplace you can call and there's somebody to answer the phone and ask, well, what are you looking for, and give you some direction. There is also the Cerebral Palsy Association, but I'm trying to be broader than that, and because disability is so vast and so broad, and also just being open to ask questions, like Jenel said. I self-declare. Well, you can see my disability as I'm walking down the street, but self-declare, and I had a therapist tell me I had to own my CP, and that really meant that I had to ask for help when I needed it, and I needed to let people know what's going on. Reading minds is a really hard thing to do, so you got to be willing to ask questions, but also be mindful of everybody else. Is we're also tired of telling our stories over and over and over again, so ask a question, right? And
Be an ally.
be an ally.
It's a fine line. Yeah, you always see sometimes a mom with their kid being like, "Oh, don't stare, don't point, don't ask," and it's like, well, that's not. Then you're creating the stigma in the kid for future to never talk or never ask and be, all that stuff. So, Jenel, last word to you.
If you're interested about accessibility in the arts, you can check out our website at aanm.ca. You can email me at info@aanm.ca. And one of the cool things, if you go on our website, we have a database of arts venues that we have already audited, about 30 of them, including the Winnipeg Art Gallery, West End Cultural Center, Centennial Concert Hall. So if you want to know what kind of accessibility attributes those places have, you can find that on our website.
Fantastic. We'll put those links in the description below on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for being on the show. This was a very good conversation. I knew it would be. You're all three powerhouses when it comes to talking about these things. I'm very grateful for your time. So thank you very much for being here and just for sharing your wisdom and sharing your knowledge and just getting these conversations started. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
YX Matters is a podcast from the Winnipeg Foundation. You can learn more about the Winnipeg Foundation and our work. You can go to wpgfdn.org or follow us at WPGFDN on all social media platforms. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time, and bye-bye.